In 2020, China's total GDP reached 101.6 trillion RMB, an increase of 2.3% from 2019, which is the first time China's GDP exceeded the 100 trillion RMB mark, or about 14.7 trillion USD, and reached 70% of the United States GDP for the first time. It is 3 times the GDP of Japan, which ranks 3rd highest in the world, and nearly 4 times the GDP of Germany, which ranks 4th. China's GDP growth of 2.3% in 2020 has caught the world's attention by becoming the only economy with positive GDP growth among the world's top 10 economies. With very few countries worldwide achieving GDP growth in 2020 due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, how did China achieve this? In 2020, China's total retail sales of consumer goods reached 39.2 trillion RMB, accounting for 38.6% of the total GDP, down 3.9% from the previous year. Fixed asset investment of 51.9 trillion RMB, accounting for 51.5% of GDP, up 2.9%. China's total import and export value of trade in goods was 32.16 trillion RMB, of which exports were 17.93 trillion and imports were 14.23 trillion, with a trade surplus of 3.7 trillion, accounting for 3.6% of the GDP. Fixed asset investment and real estate development investment alone reached 14.1 trillion RMB, achieving an added value of 7.45 trillion. The added value of the real estate industry is 88.7% of the added value of the financial industry and 78% of the added value of the wholesale and retail industry. The added value of the real estate industry, which exceeds 7.3% of the total GDP, exceeds that of many industries such as construction, transportation, warehousing and postal services, accommodation, catering, leasing and business services. It is worth pointing out that in 2020, the number of people employed in the real estate sector in China only accounted for 0.38% of the employed population. This shows that real estate was one of the core driving forces of China's economic development last year. In fact, the contribution of the real estate sector to China's economy has gradually expanded over the last 20 years. In 2000, China's real estate value added was only 414.1 billion RMB, accounting for 4.1% of GDP that year. 20 years later, in 2020, China's real estate value added jumped to 745.53 billion RMB, accounting for 7.3% of GDP. Over a period of 20 years, the value added of real estate grew at a rate of 78%. According to China's National Bureau of Statistics, the combined added value of the real estate and construction industries in 2020 is about 14.8 trillion RMB, accounting for 14.5% of the total national economy, ranking 3rd among all industries. Ranking 1st is the manufacturing industry, with an industry value added of 26.6 trillion, accounting for 26%, and other industries in the service industry with a value added of 16.7 trillion, accounting for 16%. Considering that the manufacturing and other industries are more densely subdivided, and that the number of market players is much higher than that of the real estate and construction industries, it can be seen that the real estate industry plays a pivotal role in the development of the national economy. Then, what about housing consumption in China? In 2020, the national per capita consumption expenditure of residents was 21,210 RMB. Among them, the per capita residential consumption expenditure is 5,215 RMB, accounting for 24.6%. According to the results of the population census released by the Chinese government on May 11th this year, the population living in cities and towns nationwide is 901.99 million people, accounting for 63.89% of the total population, with the remaining 509.79 million people living in the countryside. It should be especially noted that people living in the countryside live in houses built on their own homesteads, so the vast majority of residential consumption is for utilities and heating. From deduction, the per capita residential consumption expenditure of urban residents should be much larger than the official data, and the proportion of total consumption is much higher than the official number of 24.6%. On October 23, 2020, China's Minister of Housing and Urban-Rural Development, Wang Minghui, posted an article on the People's Daily online, in which he said that the per capita housing floor area for urban residents reached 39.8 square meters in 2019, and the per capita housing floor area for rural residents reached 48.9 square meters. Judging from the data, it seems like Chinese people are living quite comfortably. But it should be noted that these numbers are derived by dividing the total housing floor area by the local population. But there are many houses in China that are empty or unoccupied. In addition, the total number of migrant workers in China in 2020 is 280 million, who have their own household registrations in rural areas but work in cities. And this part of the population is also not considered when calculating the per capita housing floor area. For example, in Beijing, official data say that the resident population in 2018 was 21.54 million, and the per capita housing floor area was 34.86 square meters. According to a report released by KE Holdings, 35% of people in Beijing are renting, and the per capita rental area is only 17 square meters, which is less than half of the average. This number also suggests that full house rentals are unlikely. In actuality, around 60% of the rental population in Beijing are co-renting. An important indicator of housing affordability is the ratio of house prices to household income. A special study was completed by Shanghai eHouse Real Estate Research Institute in March this year, titled A Comparative Study on Housing Prices in 50 Cities Across China. The study found that in 2020, the average value of housing price to income ratio in 50 cities was 13.4, up 1.4% compared to 2019. Among them, the four cities of Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen have an average house price to income ratio value of 26.6, with Shenzhen being the highest at 39.8. In 2020, the national average housing price was 9,980 RMB per square meter, and the per capita income was only 3,653 RMB per month, which is equivalent to a person working for 2.7 months to buy 1 square meter of house without eating or drinking or any other expenses. At this rate, it'll take 18 years to be able to afford a house. Housing prices have two main components, the price of land and the price of the house. In China, all land is owned by the state. The people, various enterprises, social organizations, and institutions have no ownership rights to any land, only the right to use it. The government auctions off the land use rights and receives the revenue, and the enterprises or individuals usually acquire the land use rights by bidding. The Chinese government stipulates that land use rights are for a maximum of 70 years, with 70 years for residential land, 50 years for industrial land, 40 years for commercial land, and 50 years for other land. When the land use period expires, a fee must be paid to renew the right to use the land. In 2020, the total amount of land sold in 300 cities nationwide was about 6 trillion RMB, around 940 billion USD, which is 13.3% of the total income of the country's 1.4 billion people and about 6% of China's GDP that year. The overall average price of land sold in the 300 cities was 4,909 RMB per square meter. Statistics on the revenue obtained from land concessions in 2020 in 44 major cities nationwide reveal that the ratio of revenue obtained from land concessions to tax-based revenue exceeded 100% in 20 cities and 50% in 39 cities. On February 26, the head of the Department of Natural Resources Development and Utilization of the Ministry of Natural Resources announced that 22 key cities will implement a new policy of 2 concentrations for residential land in 2021. The so-called 2 concentrations, the first is to concentrate the announcements for land concession. In principle, the announcement cannot exceed 3 times a year, and the actual time interval and plots of land for sale should be relatively balanced. The second is to concentrate on the organization of the sale activities. All plots of land announced for sale by listing should have the same start and end dates. Land sold through auctions should also be grouped together. Within 26 days from April 15th to May 11th, the government of 7 cities, including Guangzhou and Beijing, auctioned land use rights. The total transaction amount reached 446.9 billion yuan. Among them, Guangzhou, Hangzhou, and Beijing achieved land transactions of more than 100 billion yuan for the first time. According to statistics, the average premium rate of land auctions in April reached 25.4%, the highest in the past 3 years. In particular, Chongqing's premium rate is as high as 44%. According to statistics in 2020, China's national average housing price is 9,980 RMB per square meter, while the average price of land use rights sold by the government was 4,909 RMB per square meter, with land accounting for 49.2% of the total house price. In large cities, land accounted for an average of over 51% of the house price, with some properties as high as 80%. Because the government sets the price of land so high, real estate companies need to pay a lot of money to the government when they acquire land. In order to reduce the ratio of land cost to selling price and improve the profit margin, real estate companies tend to build high-rise residential buildings. At the same time, in the process of project construction, real estate companies bear huge capital pressure and must build and sell the houses as quickly as possible. So the project construction often adopts the do things simultaneously principle. This means to design, construct, and modify at the same time. Therefore, the construction quality is very low and prone to many problems, such as crooked, cracked, or shaky buildings, which are common if the capital chain breaks during the construction process. The government does not care about the poor construction quality of the houses. If buildings collapse, they can be rebuilt, and the GDP growth can be boosted again. While the GDP is one of the most important indicators for performance assessment of Chinese government officials at all levels, the quality and service life of buildings are not. By pushing up the price of land, the Chinese government has reaped the wealth of society while pushing the real estate industry bubble bigger and bigger, and getting China's GDP figures better and better. As land gets more expensive, so do houses. Unaffordable housing and mortgage payments are common among young people in China. Therefore, it is now popular among young people to lie flat, which means to not buy a house, not buy a car, not get married, not have children, not spend money, and only maintain a minimum standard of living, refusing to become a money-making machine or a slave for others.